And we're live. Today's course, and today is the first of our CETP courses, and it is focused on understanding the history of trauma treatment. And the reason that we include this is because, as in every form of exploration or every form of research, there's kind of a history to it. And we want you to be kind of familiar with what the history is for the kind of work that we're suggesting that people do. So I'm just going to go ahead and move through these. And once again, if you have questions, make sure you go ahead and just holler out, and we'll make sure that we stop and answer them. So my question has always been, what leads us to where we are today? How did we get here? How did we get to the current level of what we do with clients? How do we discover what worked and what didn't work? And what's interesting to me is how often we find that the things that we do that work are things that we have done as as the race of human beings that have always worked. So let me kind of review with you a little bit. I don't want to go back into the 2500 BC range, but the Ionians were a prosperous and very intellectual people. They were the precursors to the Greeks, and they had almost all of their philosophy was divided into these basic questions. And we aren't used to thinking about the fact that people have been asking these questions as long as they've been people. And so some of the questions that they asked and the ways that they answered them were very interesting. Is there only one substance? Is mind something different than matter? Do we have souls? And if so, what are they? Are the mind and body separate, or are they connected? Is human nature the result of innate tendencies or experiences? How do we know what we know? Are our perceptions of the world true? What are the mechanisms of sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste? And is there a correct way to gain knowledge? And if so, what might it be? And the last one that played out in a lot of their philosophical questions was, does the mind rule our emotions? The reason I am introducing this isn't that we're going to use many of these, but is the idea that as human beings, we have been looking at the basic questions of who we are, how we operate, and how best to help us move in the direction of creating a high quality of life, recover from things that we experience, and be able to heal. And part of the people's answers to these questions kind of determine how we move and how we think and how we handle things like illness and disease and how we define it. We are currently using the DSM-5, which I won't be talking much about today, but we are still trying to answer most of these basic questions, and that, at 3,000 years later, we're still not having definitive answers. And the answers that we feel are definitive tend to change around. But one of the interesting things about that change around is that it seems to become cyclic. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence was not a new idea. Emotional intelligence actually, as Gardner kind of wrote about it, is a revamping of what the Mandarins did 1300 BC in order to evaluate whether someone should be a leader. So it isn't that this stuff is new, we just rediscover it over and over again. So part of the concept that I want to offer to you is that what works and what we have now established with science and research that works is not terribly different than what has worked for thousands of years. So part of the challenge that we face is that, particularly in Western cultures, is we have kind of a presentism of mindset. And the presentism is really kind of a phenomena of Western culture. And what it basically says is that we believe that as of right now, we have the best answers, that we understand the best that we've ever understood, that we're at the pinnacle of our development as human beings right now at this stage. And what I want to suggest is that what we have done today is basically to, rather than discover anew, is that we've rediscovered the answers that have been true for generations. Since the late 90s, we've been looking at using meta-analysis to discover what works in therapy and why it works. And you're familiar with those because we embed them into the CCTP training. Let's just, as a quick review, kind of go through what the active ingredients are, because that's what we've discovered. These things work regardless, and they have worked, and we have plenty of research to support that they work. And so the first one we are always looking at is the therapeutic relationship, the ability for a person to self-regulate and relax the body, to be able to look at what and review what they've experienced, get to the place where they can do that without becoming reactive to it, and actually change the way people think and perceive and feel as it relates to it, is what we really do with cognitive restructuring, which we sometimes call reconnection or reconsolidation. These are not new. While we have research that's just grown in abundance since 1997, they aren't new ideas. Let me introduce them to you a little different way. Let's look at how early healing practices were focused. Now, these were focused either in traditional, what we would consider traditional healer formats, or shamanism. And essentially, the primary aspect that the shaman or healer had was that they had a relationship because they were part of, and they were a recognized part of, the community within which they lived. So not only did they already know everybody, but they were tied into everybody. And many times they were tied into them because of the fact that they had relationships, shared friendships, but they were deeply tied to their community. What did the healing practices of the early healer kind of fall along? What lines did they fall along? Well, they always suggested that people have adequate sleep, that they eat healthily, that they are engaged in movement. They used body massage. They used manipulation of the body to help the body realign and to function as it should. They talked about and demonstrated meditation and reflection and self-reflection. They also had a number of rites and rituals to change one's beliefs and to focus attention on certain parts of an experience. So if you think about what we're really saying here, these are the active ingredients that have been part of healing practice since we've really been recording history for human beings. And they work, and they have consistently worked. So let's just kind of go through them again real quickly. That you have a relationship as a healer. That what are we really looking at with adequate sleep, diet, movement, body massage, and manipulation to help the body realign? Can we really kind of talk about, regulation, self-regulation, and isn't that really what that's all about? Meditation and self-reflection are really tied to mindfulness. It's interesting that we have made such a huge industry out of mindfulness in the last decade, when in reality it's been part of the healing process really up until it was stripped out around in the Freudian arena meditation and self-reflection were then, if you will, repackaged into psychodynamic process. Then there's rituals and rites to change one's beliefs and to change our focus. Isn't that cognitive restructuring? So essentially, what I'm going to suggest today is that what works with people, what we know works with people, has always worked with people. And that we had a period of time where we got away from that, or we didn't have enough science to support it, and we've gone off on a number of other paths. So I think we're in a place where we're moving in a much more healthy direction for the treatment, particularly of trauma. So I want to kind of look at the ways that ancient shamans practice, and I'm going to compare them to and call them the first trauma therapists. First of all, the person of the healer was generally, at least initially, in a position that was adopted entirely voluntarily. Nobody assigned them to be the healer. Usually, depending on the tradition of the people, you may have believed that you were chosen by a spirit, or you were chosen by life experiences and had been prepared for that. Nearly all of the people that emerged as shamans or healers usually suffered a great deal in their own life. Many of them, when you look at the literature around it, many of them had been deeply injured and sometimes permanently crippled by the experiences that they had had. And, many of them also suffered with their own chronic illnesses. We have several that were in different cultures that actually experienced psychotic breaks and or had near-death experiences. One of the things that we often kind of run into in the field of trauma work is the people that are attracted to doing it frequently have their own history of trauma that has sensitized them to this work and a desire to do this work. And so that is not terribly uncommon from the history of our first trauma therapists. An experience of, that the shamans went through themselves is, and what they usually brought to the work that they did with people was how they rebuilt their own lives, how they maintained themselves. And they basically were using their own experiences in recovery as a tool to help, the tribe or the clan within which they were operating. Some of the things that are kind of interesting about this is that it operates, if you want to think about shamanic practice, its main focus, time, and energy are all kind of focused pretty specifically on bringing relief from suffering to people. And where that emerged was usually after their own kind of success at being able to maneuver this. And how many times is that still true, that while we wouldn't necessarily say, well, it's a prerequisite for trauma work, that would be ridiculous. But many of the times that we are looking at kind of being involved in trauma work really are really very much because of what we feel is important. We want to be of service. And in the shamanic practice, a lot of times they considered the act of healing a spiritual service to the community. So at this point, I don't know if you have a question or not, but essentially my idea here is that as trauma therapists, as people that are working with trauma, we are intricately involved in a thought process and in a practice that is thousands of years old, and that what we have discovered in the last 20 years is that what works is what has always worked with people. So I'm going to kind of move through and kind of talk about some of the corollaries. And this isn't a one-to-one corollary, but I'm going to suggest a traditional way of healing and give it a comparison to what we do today, and see if that makes some sense to you. So when we start talking about the way the shamans dealt with experiences that they were trying to help people work through, one of the first things that they used a lot of was what we would consider journeying. This is very similar to what we would do in resolution work. If you think about what we do in the resolution piece, which is stage 3 of treatment, what you're doing is getting them to look at the experience without becoming reactive to the experience. You're getting them to be able to review the narrative over and over again to the point where it is no longer disturbing to them. You're using that journey, if you will, to create a new way of understanding the experience. The other thing that they used quite often was a trance state, which was an altered state of consciousness, or a way to change one's perception and look beyond the limitations of the experience. Isn't that what we do in cognitive restructuring? Don't we help them see it differently, to see past the limitations that have held them fixed before, that we have helped them not only change their understanding of it, but change how they understand how it even functions in their body as we move through it. In most cultures, they talk a lot about spirit guides. And in some cultures, the spirit guides are more friendly than others. But essentially, the spirit guide was to assist people so that they can move on to the next chapter of the journey. In a sense, it was the idea that there are forces outside of themselves that will help them get through this and help them move on to the next stage of life. We sometimes use that actively, particularly those people that work in pastoral settings, but a lot of times we are really talking about being able to help people develop a sense of faith, a sense of hope in the future, in a future that does not have this degree of pain and suffering in it. What are we really talking about there is the idea that people can move past this part of their journey and they can go to the next part of their journey. And that is part of what we're doing. Now, whether we call it a spirit guide or not, that's totally irrelevant for what we're doing, but it is certainly interesting that that was part of the process. Another part of the process, the way that they defined things, was that what they called soul loss. And it's interesting because when you read the descriptions of it, it really does read like an emotional reaction to things. I just don't feel like myself. I feel lost. I feel stuck. It feels like part of myself is gone. I can't remember important parts. When you start looking at soul loss, how often are we dealing with that in trauma? That important part of their identity has been lost or fractured or bruised. And what we're doing as we work through it is helping them learn to understand themselves better. So these are not foreign ideas. They are not a big stretch. But what is kind of funny to me is how much we have relied on what has always worked in order to move us into the future of what we do with folks. So part of my question is, tomorrow really about yesterday? If we think about indigenous healers, or what some people might label as traditional healers, often they use tools that we wouldn't use in therapy, and that's fine. But what they're really doing is using whatever tools they do employ to co-create healing in the lives of those that they serve. Often people looking at Native traditions will sometimes get lost in the accoutrements, the drumming, the dream catchers, and all of the little variety of fetishes or objects. They are really not that important in and of themselves. What they are is they're representing ideas or processes that help people to move through it. It isn't terribly different than what we do when we structure a session or we orient and acculturate somebody to the treatment process, or we follow through every week and giving them, reviewing the feedback with them, or when we do concurrent documentation with them. What we're basically doing is creating this process that has identifiable parts in it. And sometimes we even use drumming more and more in some areas of trauma work these days. But it is this process of creating a meaningful something that we attach the process of treatment to that becomes kind of important. And I'm going to just read my comment here. However, what is left unsaid is that the attributes of the healer, which are more relevant, one of the tools that is needed as a traditional healer is the ability to see into the world of another. So one of the things we run into a lot of times is this ability to see into the world of another is a popular concept in traditional healing. What does that really mean, to be able to see into the world of another? Well, the quality of seeing into the world of another person is more than just feeling a sense of empathy and embracing more than understanding how to navigate that world. What we're really looking at is being able to let go of ourselves well enough that we can truly be with another human being, that we aren't going to bring our demands, our expectations, our understanding to it, but we are going to understand theirs. And we're going to understand theirs well enough that we can help them see themselves moving forward and backward in their own world. And being able to project a history as well as a future, recognizing what roles and statuses and obligations they have from their perspective. Essentially, when we do, a lot of times when we use a timeline to build capacity, to build a sense of understanding of what's happened to people and what would be the natural things that would grow out of that, what we're doing is basically teaching them how to view their own world and how to navigate that world and how to move backwards and forwards through that world and how to see it differently. We must see the world of the person that we're helping and be able to see it differently, to see it in a way that encourages them to see it differently. Because if we can see it differently, then they can see it differently. And that really opens the door for us to do a restructuring of their cognitions around this. And finally, the perception of being a whole person. That is one of the large elements of seeing into another's world, is being able to see them in context, to see them as a unity, as a whole person. And that whole people are incongruent, they're messy, they're flawed, they have fears, they have concerns, and they have passions in multiple areas of their life that compete with each other. And that we understand that that is completely correct for being a human being. And we help them see that it is completely correct for being a human being. The last concept that I want to spend time on regarding what is common in healing practices across the world, particularly the ancient ones, was that there was an idea that once you began to heal, that you would automatically begin to increase your right choices. Now, in our popular current view of things, what we're really talking about is when people can regulate themselves, when people are no longer sympathetically system dominant, then they're in a place to choose based on the activation of their executive system or their parasympathetic nervous system, that they will choose a better quality of life, that they will choose right action. Well, that is not a new idea. That idea of choosing right action has been part of the traditional healing practices as long as we've been documenting it. So one of the consistent philosophies that seem to be a part of traditional healing is the idea that healing and improved quality of life are based primarily on the rightness of choice. In other words, people improve as they make right choices. Now, that's not necessarily right choices from the point of view as we as the therapist or as the society at large, but as they make right choices based on their view of things, coupled with the idea that if they are relaxed and they're composed, they have greater facility to make right choices. And isn't really that what we're kind of committed to, is getting people in a place where their body is relaxed, a place where they're self-regulating well so that they can choose differently from what they have been doing, where they have been reactive and responsive to being aroused. Now they're in a state where they can be very much make a choice, make a decision, follow through on it. That really does require access to access to the parasympathetic nervous system. And finally, right action is considered the normal state of a composed, relaxed, and healed person. One of the things that we kind of get hung up in is, if we would think about healers, a lot of times they would be considered paraprofessionals, but they help survivors find and engage in right action. Essentially, that's what we are doing as therapists as well, is we are helping people regulate themselves, get into a place where they can make active, deliberate, intentional choices. And our concept of that is that as they do so, they will make right choices for themselves, and they will find ways to improve the quality of their own life. This is different than the focus on behavior as the primary starting point, where if we start on behavior, what we're dealing with is a correct response that is driven out of a failure to regulate something, regulate your system. But when the system is regulated, there is what I've often called a self-corrective process, or an autocorrect that takes place, and people begin automatically, naturally, to move into more right actions. They may not be right actions from the point of view of legality. They may not be right action from the point of view of social acceptance. They may not be right action from an approved religious perspective, but they are right action to move the person forward in the life that is improving. And so that's been an intricate part of traditional healing practices, but is also intricate to what we do in our own field of trauma work. When Eric's book comes out in probably February, the forward-facing therapy, what forward-facing therapy is really founded on is the idea is, once we help people resolve the hurts and eliminate the pain that keeps their system operating in a reactive and volatile way, that they're in a place where they can make right choices. And that when they choose right action, it leads to recovery, it leads to relief, it leads to growth and change. And so that's what we're primarily promoting. The cessation of pain is never adequate. The cessation of pain is not an improved quality of life. And as part of what we're doing in trauma work is a cessation of pain to help people move into the place where they can make more right action. So I'm not going to take any more time with that. I'm going to basically move on. The removal of bad or hurtful energy. This was a shamanistic practice. And what did we do with it? What they were looking at is unresolved anger, grief, depression, sadness, fear. They believed it became lodged in the body, and they had intricate rituals to remove it from the body. Well, what do we say? That it's the foundation of a physiological system that's at work. When the sympathetic nervous system is dominant, we have these things stored in the body. So we have come along with science and established what has been a common thought in the world of traditional healing for thousands of years. Emotions and anger and rage and jealousy, they are that are directed towards other people, interfere with our ability to, to take right action. Traumatic experiences such as illness and surgery and accidents and all of the things that we would normally think as being relatively large triggers also bring activation in the systems that keep us reactive and impulsive. So part of what the traditional practices were is how do we help people release and remove this bad energy? And they had lots of ways of doing it. Some of them were, you read about them and you kind of tongue-in-cheek say, well, that would be very bizarre. But the reality is that they had a process that was socially and culturally accepted to help people be released from the effects of these bad energies. In a sense, that's what we're doing with therapy. We are really helping people be released from the bad energies that have been stored in their body. We even have a whole field in the world of trauma work called somatic therapy or somatic experiencing. And what is it really talking about is learning to recognize and be free from the negative and bad energy stored in your body. So does this seem like a strange place for you guys for us to start? If we look at what works with people, even though we have much better science and research to support our efforts than those that have gone before us, there are important lessons still to be learned from what those that have gone before us have discovered. And if we don't know the history, how will we benefit from the legacy that they left? And that's kind of my thought process. When I started looking at how to do trauma work more efficiently, one of the things I explored was what had worked for generations. And what that freed me up from freed me from getting locked into specific models of treatment, because I began to see a model of treatment as one of as a shamanistic ritual, as a shamanistic practice, as a way to accomplish the greater goals. And what I started looking at was, well, if I look at the model of treatment as just a particular tool to work through this, what is the process that has been used for generations? And that process is really what we're dealing with. And the structure that we teach in the CCTP is really, if you want to think about it, based on those active ingredients, it is there to help us feel an overall process. Or if you want to think about it, it is a shamanistic process or a healer's process. And models can be plugged in as you would any ritual into the process of it and make it be effective. So I'm ready to move forward and leave traditional historical practice and kind of look at some of the things that we know that historically people have been suggesting these things, suggesting this process for some time. Jean Carcat was a huge influence on Freud, even though in frustration, Freud could never match his wisdom, his insight, or his ability to work with people. But Carcat was interesting. He worked with over 5,000 patients. And Carcat was really the first that we have in modern times, other than maybe Genet, that understood that the origin of hysterical symptoms was not purely physiological, but it was rather triggered or activated by psychological experience. And so people weren't just hysterical because they were genetically programmed that way, or there wasn't some huge deficit in them. But his concept was that they were engaged in hysteria, which, if you look at the symptoms of hysteria that Carcat wrote about, are very much the symptoms that we deal with in trauma. But hysteria was a psychological and an emotional reaction to things that had happened to people. Now, Freud kind of messed it up a little bit when he wrote about it, because he talked about it being tied to things like females being more hysterical because of the nature of the female being. And in some ways, his prominence and popularity actually interfered with us being able to treat people for trauma efficiently. Part of, I'm going to move through this because I've talked through him already. I'm going to talk about Pierre Genet. He was very much part of looking at dissociative phenomena and traumatic memories. And what he looked at was and investigated was how the patient's experiences impacted the way their personalities developed, or the personality changes that occurred. And he basically looked at two different types of neurotic disturbance. And one, which he called the basic symptoms, which was a narrowing of consciousness and an alteration of reality. Isn't that what trauma victims do? Is they become over-focused on or overreactive to a few basic things, and they end up with this internal reaction to external events. And Genet really picked up on the idea of that something is going on out here in the world that is having an impact on how we experience things internally, or that external thing has created an internal reaction to us. Today, that is really what we understand trauma to be. Part of what Genet's work got kind of buried because of the popularity of Freud's psychoanalytic work. As another popular person at this time, not popular in societal ways, but popular in that their work, Adler was also involved in this time, and Adler's work was much stronger and made a lot more sense to the treatment of people than what Freud was popularizing. Once again, we have an example, and we've had many, many examples in the world of learning and education, and in particularly in service to other people, where the person that gets the press, the person that everybody kind of mimics and goes to, is not a person that's really very skilled at what they do. I think of that the number of clinicians that I've heard that have mirrored and mimicked the Dr. Phil comments. And there's no way that Dr. Phil is actually a reliable, helpful healer, but he's popularized. And we see it also in a number of other arenas where people's work becomes popularized, but their capacity to really bring healing to people isn't in line with their popularity. popularity has very little to do with the quality of work being done. It has more to do with marketing and message and acceptability to the masses of what is being said. Another one that I think is really important to get a handle on is Abram Gardner. Gardner started to treat U.S. war veterans, and he basically was the one that started talking about the reenactment, or what we would call flashbacks. And he wrote about it fairly consistently, and he developed kind of an understanding of what was going on. Gardner's rarely given credit, I think, for what he was suggesting, and that was that trauma symptoms were normal responses to unbearable situations. In other words, people were not bizarre and weird and crazy because they were responding this way. They were responding exactly as they should behave, considering what they had been experiencing. In other words, the history of their own trauma led them to impulsive reactive behaviors that were entirely correct behaviors. So Gardner was kind of a maverick in that, because everybody was so behaviorally focused, saying the behavior was problematic, and he was saying, no, the behavior is exactly correct. It is their way of dealing with what these unbearable things that happen to them. This is their behavioral expression of that. Some of the things that he was quite explicit about was the persistence of a startle response and increased irritability, and he often wrote about impulsivity, the proclivity to have explosive outbursts and be aggressive. He wrote a lot about being fixated on the events, whether that was in memory or in focus and attention. And he talked about how as people became more reactive, more irritable, more impulsive, more aggressive, having more outbursts, and the more they became fixated on an event, the more their personality and functioning became constricted. He also talked quite a bit about that they have an atypical dream life and an atypical sleep life. So we have had exposure to this for some time. We've had an idea of how people were not working well, and the kinds of struggles that they were having. However, it wasn't the popular thing. And so a lot of what we could have been doing, which is what has always worked for people, we weren't doing. What we ended up getting focused on starting in the 60s was to get focused on behavior over process. In other words, it's the behavior that's the problem. It isn't what led to the behavior. I mean, we would give that lip service and we would talk about, well, we have to understand the reasons for it. But the whole field of applied behavior analysis emerged that was really looking at antecedents rather than understanding that the behavior was correct. And what we really need to do is get people out of that system that maintains the behavior. So why should we be interested in the history of trauma or in the history of the trauma diagnosis and treatment? Just a little bit that I've kind of overviewed for you today. I'm hoping that you have a greater awareness that it helps us kind of free ourselves from the dictatorial nature of the societal view, that it's all about the behavior, and also that it frees us from the patronage or the, if you will, the catechism of a single model. What we're really talking about here is understanding the history of trauma treatment and diagnosis is really quite lengthy. It goes back thousands of years. And essentially it comes back to an understanding of the active ingredients and how do we deliver service to people. from an active ingredients modality, how do we capture what always has worked for human beings and structure it in a way that it's digestible to the client? How do we help them navigate the journey of their own life? And as we navigate that, it is more about leaving them in a place of growth when we're finished, rather than leaving them with just a cessation of the pain and distress that they've experienced. So this is pretty much all I had prepared for you this evening. I have a couple of other folks that I like to talk about, but I'm going to pass. And basically, we're going to pull this up. Let me stop recording.